and what options might be there for the Titans, who have a huge need at wide receiver on days 2 and 3. That's why we got Matt Harmon on the show, at Matt Harmon _BYB, football writer and analyst for Yahoo Sports, the creator of a really interesting method of evaluation for receivers called reception perception. It's a podcast of its own as well, a really interesting perspective on the wide receiver position specifically. And Matt, really appreciate the time and the perspective here as we're about 3 weeks out from the draft. So close, but so far. Appreciate you joining us.
It does feel so close, but so far. That is always what this time of year feels like to me, because, I'm still obviously playing catch up on this class. Like, to me, I don't get started on the prospects until usually, obviously, certainly once the NFL regular season ends. And really now is when I'm doing most of the work on it. So, yeah, it feels far away in terms of like, okay, the exhausting news cycle, everything like that. But I'm still trying to get every minute I can to get as much data, as much reception perception charting on these prospects. So I'm really excited to talk with you guys today.
Well, I go back to what Kyle Shanahan said about when they traded up to draft Trey Lance and how he admitted that he overthought that process, that he was in on Mac Jones and let himself talk himself into going up for Trey Lance. So you say you need every minute you can get, but I'm just curious, is there a point where you kind of have to just put up a barrier and say, okay, if I continue past this point, then I'm just going to start going back and second guessing and doing things that will take me away from some of my instincts on these guys?
Well, that's why I really love, it sounds weird to say that about something that I created. So, I'm very self-aware that this is going to sound ridiculous to say, but this is why I love reception perception, and the process of it is that the standard for all of these players, when enough film is available, is an 8-game sample. So once we get to that 8 games and once everything is checked off, like, the data is the data. There's no going back and saying like, okay, can I get another game in to maybe see more reps against man coverage? Like, at some point, and honestly, I've gotten feedback from people that have worked for teams and, currently work for teams. It's like, 8 games is more than a lot of our scouts are filing reports on. So, I do think there's a tendency to, I guess it's always great to discuss with other people, your findings and your thoughts, and to say, hey, like, did you see this or did you notice this? And, sometimes I think you can have too many of those conversations and then you do start kind of going in that circle with a player. But again, from a process standpoint, this is why I've always kind of kept the charting the same ever since I came up with the idea 12 years ago, to be able to not just compare each player within himself, but also to previous guys, positional archetypes, and everything of that nature.
So as you've gone through this prospect with this wide receiver draft class specifically, who is the guy that, I don't want to say you've changed your opinion most on since the start of the pre-draft process, but maybe as you've gotten deeper into the metrics and the specific way that you do it has kind of risen above the rest in a way that maybe you didn't anticipate?
Oh, it's got to be Travis Hunter. And I know he's obviously a guy who might not play full-time wide receiver in the NFL, but, I don't watch college football during the season. I know who Travis Hunter is, of course, wins the Heisman. I'm familiar with the story of it all, but going to the process, I didn't really know like what type of wide receiver he would be. I knew that he was a two-way player. He was very productive as a wide receiver. But, I was kind of curious because coming to the process, like I said, post-NFL season and everything, kind of the general consensus with him was a guy that would, he'd be a cornerback first and would moonlight as a wide receiver. And I think that's easier for us to conceptualize, right? Like the full-time cornerback and then part-time wide receiver. I think it's a little weirder to think about it the other way. He's going to be a full-time, wide receiver and then come in and play defensive back on third downs and man up on a number one. It just gets a little trickier, I think. All that being said, so I come into the process with kind of like a clear perspective on what he is as a receiver. I was blown away by his film as a receiver. 97th percentile success rate versus zone coverage and reception perception, 97th percentile success rate versus press. He really reminds me a lot of like prime Odell Beckham from a reception perception standpoint, like a full field separator, maybe a little bit loose as a route runner, but great off the line of scrimmage, incredible, truly rare ball skills and ability, like just catching ability. And he also has an explosiveness after the catch to really like, just like prime OBJ, like I said, take a quick inbreaker and house it. So I came into this not knowing if we would get a tier 1, like to me, a guy that you can take in the top 10 and he's ready made to start in the NFL. That's what a tier 1 wide receiver prospect is to me. I wasn't sure if we'd get one of those in this class. And obviously Hunter might not be that because he's potentially going to be a two-way player. But I think he shows the traits and the potential as a prospect to be that type of guy in the NFL if he does focus solely on wide receiver.
Yeah, we've had to kind of catch ourselves on this show, Matt, when we're talking about wide receiver 1 and we're starting the conversation with Tent McMillan and Luther Burden.
Right.
And then it's like, no. But wide receiver 1 here is Travis Hunter. But you're right, it depends so heavily on where he lands and how they utilize him. But Travis Hunter, kind of aside, is such a specific, unique situation there where you almost put him in a category by himself. When you look at the 3 of Tent McMillan, Luther Burden, and Matthew Golden, of those 3, who do you think would be more likely to fall into the top of the second round, as the team here in Nashville and the Titans obviously have a huge need that could very well be addressed there at the top of the second round?
Yeah, and by the way, I love that idea of them taking Cam Ward first overall and then coming back with a wide receiver at the top of the second round. It's not too dissimilar to what the Bengals did with Joe Burrow and T. Higgins. And obviously, Brian Callahan is familiar with that situation, former offensive coordinator with the Bengals, current Titans head coach. Everybody knows that. Like, that's a very clear roadmap for them to go down. And I will say, I don't necessarily, unless those guys that you mentioned slip, I don't necessarily see a guy that's in the T. Higgins caliber as a prospect, like in kind of that range of players. But that being said, like if one of those guys was to slip that you mentioned there, I think Tent McMillan goes in the first round, whether he ends up actually being a top 10 pick or if he does tumble down a little bit. I think he ultimately still goes in the first round. I think Matthew Golden's got a great shot to be the first receiver off the board. There's so much buzz and so many people connecting him with the Dallas Cowboys, and I actually think that's a great fit. I can really see how they would use him well with what I think Brian Schottenheimer wants to do. Ultimately, I think those two guys are first-round locks. I think the next 2 players on the board, now I rate Emeka Egbuka as the second receiver in this draft. If he's there at the top of the second round for the Tennessee Titans, he's not like that perimeter ball winner, like a true X receiver, which is kind of what I think they need alongside Calvin Ridley. But he is a incredible slot receiver. He's great against zone coverage. I think he just immediately comes in and day one is ready to start as your flanker slot option. Like I said, it's not a perfect complement with Calvin Ridley, who I think is a flanker that they want to kind of move around the formation. They probably want like a true big X receiver. But again, I think he is a guy that I think is a clear-cut first-round pick and is my second receiver in this draft class. Luther Burden, I think, has a shot to go in the second round because there are people concerned with off-the-field kind of questions about him and things of that nature. He's also kind of I think he's the most confusing evaluation in this class because he shows you really high potential as a man coverage beating player, but he was almost exclusively a slot receiver. He got a lot of like gadgety touches. I think again, if you're grading to the flashes with Luther Burden, he shows you enough to be like I think more than just a slot receiver. It's just, is he going to put the full work in to kind of become that guy in the NFL? That's the biggest question with him. So I think if I was to put like odds on it, I think he has the highest odds to be available of the guys that we've talked about so far at the Titans' first pick in the second round.
Talking with Matt Harmon of Yahoo Sports, the creator of Reception Perception. You can subscribe, listen to the podcast. Also follow it on Twitter at Recept Perception, where you can find that handle. So let's say Luther Burden's off the board, Matthew Golden, Tent McMillan, those sort of top 3 guys outside of Travis Hunter are off the board when the Titans pick comes around. And you look at the needs this team has when it comes to edge, receiver, and then at that point, maybe you're into the best available mode as the Titans try to fill out this roster that has a great many needs, Matt. In terms of a guy that could complement Calvin Ridley, that sort of fits the framework of what you were talking about there, what is then the next phase, the next tier of wide receivers? And do you think it's plausible to dip into that tier rather than take a best available edge if you're the Titans and somebody you like has fallen down out of the first round?
Yeah, and again, if we're strictly thinking about the type of receiver that I think fits well with Calvin Ridley. Like, I think DeAndre Hopkins was that guy. I also thought like Nick Westbrook-Akina kind of became that guy for the Titans. Now, you want to shoot a little higher, I think, than Nick Westbrook-Akina if you're taking a guy like in the top of the second round, really in like day 2 of the draft. But it's that true X receiver that can be more of a vertical threat. Like, I think Trey Harris out of Ole Miss fits this group. I'm not sure if I have the complete conviction on Trey Harris to say like he would be a locked in second round pick for me, but there are people that like him a lot. And he's a guy that you hear this a lot about college prospects, like, oh, they only run like a small handful of routes. But Trey Harris actually only runs like a small handful of routes. Over 55% of the routes I've charted so far for Trey Harris are go, curl, and screen. Like, coming out of that Ole Miss offense, it's very stripped down. At the same time, though, he shows you flashes of being more of a full field man coverage beating receiver at that size and being able to win against man coverage. Yeah, he fits that X receiver prototype. I also think, Jackson Dart at Ole Miss, the best parts of his game were really I think the ball placement on go routes to a guy like Trey Harris. I just have much more conviction that Cam Ward can access more of that than a guy like Jackson Dart. So to me, Trey Harris, if we're looking for that big X receiver, I think he probably is kind of in that range. If we're going down a little bit further, Alec Aomanor out of Stanford is another guy that I'm a little bit all over the place on because he has the requisite size, and I think, man, he can beat man coverage as well. But he kind of is a little bit. He's loose at the catch point. He struggles with like consistently catching the ball in tight coverage, where I think a guy like Harris is much better at that. So he might be, to me, more of like a third round option. If we go that best player available a little earlier, he's more round 3 type to me than a round 2 player. But I do think those are kind of the names that we're looking at if we're talking about bigger X receivers. And that's kind of the compliment that I want with Calvin Ridley.
Yeah, because right now, Matt, you look at that wide receiver room, it's Calvin Ridley, and then you go down to Van Jefferson. Right? You go down to Treylon Burks, who hasn't been available or productive for this team since he was drafted. You go down to Mason Kinsey, Bryce Oliver, undrafted free agents. And the Titans obviously spent a lot of resources in beefing up the offensive line in front of who we presume to be Cam Ward this coming season. I'm just fascinated for an expert and someone who is as passionate about the wide receiver position as you are when it comes to the metric of measuring a young quarterback between pass protection and an array of weaponry for him to get the ball to. What ends up as a higher priority for you, somebody that studies the wide receiver position so closely?
Yeah, first of all, just because you mentioned the name Treylon Burks, he's a great lesson in terms of scouting prospects. For me, he coming into the draft, right, even before he was a Tennessee Titan, it was, well, look at his frame. He looks like A.J. Brown. He didn't play like A.J. Brown. Like, he did not have the route running ability. Like, you can be as big and theoretically fast as you want, but if you're not tight on the technical part of the position, which I think AJ was always super underrated on, not to dig the knife and for Titans fans here any further than it needs to be.
That's all the way in,
yeah, how much farther can it go? I mean, just again, like that was they look the same, they don't play the same. Like, Treylon Burks to me was a guy that always looked like a player who should kick into the slot, even though he had the size to be more of an outside player. He looked much more of like a Juju Smith-Schuster power slot player in terms of his reception perception profile. And frankly, he just has never gotten the chance to play that position. So I think obviously he was a letdown of a draft pick. I just don't think the vision was there for him either. So when we're looking at guys in this year's class, I think Jaden Higgins fits in that group, big receiver that probably could kick into the slot. But to your point to your question about what's more of a priority, as much as I'm the wide receiver guy, I think that we don't need to look back any further than last year's number 1 overall pick to say that putting together a better pass protection plan, and I would say a passing game that's well designed with concepts that make sense off of each other is so much more important for a young quarterback's development than giving them a bunch of options out on the route. Not everybody agrees with this. I almost kind of think that the Bears gave Caleb Williams too many options last year, especially when you've got 2 former Pro Bowl receivers in Keenan Allen and DJ Moore who have a level of expectation of how much volume they are going to get and how involved they're going to be in the offense. And then you take, to me, one of the best receivers in last year's draft class, and Rome Odunze at the 9th overall pick. there's just there's not enough footballs to go around. There's not enough points to be scored for all three of those guys to be satisfied. And then you also have a tight end that you've given a second contract to in Cole Kmet. So at some point you get a lot of egos in the room as well. And I'm not even saying egos to be a negative thing. These guys are all great players. They should have that level of ego about themselves. You could tell there was some discontent in that wide receiver room last year, which to me, I think you're then putting more pressure on your young quarterback when there's already so much pressure on the first overall pick coming in to save the franchise and all of that stuff. So to me, I really like what the Titans have done. Yeah, you want more options than currently what they have. No question about it if you're taking Cam Ward first overall, which we all assume they are going to do. However, I think giving him an offensive line that it could at least be maybe average to even slightly above average. I think they're hoping for slightly above average. I like that a lot better than, hey, let's give him, 3 number 1 receivers. I think we overload young quarterbacks doing it that way.
Yeah, and we'll see how soon they address that position in the draft, and if they bring any more free agents in, some guys still available of intrigue still out there on the open market. I am curious to ask you this, Matt, about wide receivers coming out of the University of Tennessee. This year specifically with Dante Thornton and Brew McCoy. And it's been a big discussion point around here, the offense they're coming out of, and the fact that none of those guys yet, Jalen Hyatt, go back to Velus Jones, Cedric Tillman, have taken off in a way that could trickle down in terms of the impact it can have on recruiting for Tennessee and buck that trend that offense just doesn't translate in the NFL. Where are you on that concept as a whole, and specifically these 2 prospects with Thornton seemingly the higher rated one?
Yeah, my colleague at Yahoo Sports, Charles McDonald, and I have done a prospect deep dive series for I think this is the 3rd year we've done it now on the Yahoo Fantasy Forecast feed, which I host over there. And he's called that offense the Looney Tunes offense, for the last few seasons. And it's just it's a great college offense. And Josh Heupel and the guys are dialed in on what it takes to win at the collegiate level, which that's their job. Their job is to not develop NFL receivers. Their job is to win football games and score a bunch of points, which they're great at doing. So I think the problem, though, is then when we're starting to look at these guys as NFL prospects, just a lot of what they do in that offense does not map to the NFL because the field is different. The sport really is different when we're just looking at the hash marks and the space that's available to them. I think Cedric Tillman's a great example of this. He's a guy that I think was coming on at times last year. Like if he had not had those concussion issues, I actually think that we might be talking about him a little bit differently if he was able to sustain the production that he had in the middle of the season for the Browns. But his rookie year was basically a complete wash. And yeah, a guy like Jalen Hyatt has not been able to produce because he had it even more. Like Tillman, if you're just stacking those 2 guys, and this is why I liked Tillman a little bit better as a prospect than Jalen Hyatt, Tillman actually had real deal NFL sort of alignment from a on the line of scrimmage, X receiver stuff, running some more real routes with while being along the boundary, whereas Hyatt just had all that space. That stuff, again, just does not map to the NFL. That being said, Cedric Tillman is one of these guys that lined up in his reception perception sample on 90.7% of his snaps at the right outside receiver position. That does not happen in the NFL. And this is something that I've focused on for, I would say, dating back to the 2017 class. I started to notice this, that the guys in college who only line up on one side of the field, they really struggle to make an immediate impact. I'm thinking of guys like Josh Doxson, Corey Coleman, Laquan Treadwell back in the day, like the busts of the busts. Quentin Johnston, with the LA Chargers, he struggled to make a consistent impact because he was only a one side of the field player. Again, it just doesn't map to the NFL at all from a deployment perspective. And I think that increases the learning curve when then you've got to come to the league and line up at multiple spots and multiple splits as opposed to just that one position where you're lining up in college.
Matt, we could keep going. So many more prospects I'd love to ask you about. Maybe we have you back before the draft to kind of cross some of those T's and dot some I's, man, but don't want to take up your entire day here. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a really fun class this year with some decent depth. So hopefully the Titans can grab somebody for Cam Ward here.
No doubt. Matt Harmon, the creator of Reception Perception, Yahoo Sports. Find him on Twitter at Matt Harmon _BYB has been our guest. Does great work. Great work. The NFL as a whole, but specifically the wide receiver position. Go follow his stuff if you're looking at some of those options for the Titans on days 2 and 3. Really appreciate him giving